You can start. Okay, thank you. So I'm Foteini Tsibiridu. I am professor of social anthropology on the Department of Balkan, Slavic and Oriental Studies at the University of Macedonia in Thessaloniki. I am one of the main members of the collective Decolonize Hellas. And tonight we have a webinar with the title Defacing Patriarchies at the Mediterranean Borders, the Decolonial at Stake for Mizrahi and Basque Feminism. I will be the organizer and the moderator of this panel. And we have the pleasure to have with us two invited speakers. One is Smadar Lavie, an anthropologist from the University of California, Davis. She's emerita professor there. And we'll have the pleasure also to have her on the board of our initiative, Decolonize Hellas. The other one is Maggie Bullen. She's an anthropologist too. She's coming from the University of Basque Country and senior lecturer of the Department of Philosophy of Values and Social Anthropology. We have also the two discussants with us, Christina Grammatikopoulou, who is a postdoc student at the University of Macedonia with me, and her specialty is history of art and feminism. And Sis Theodosiou, who is associate professor of social anthropology at the University of Ioannina in Greece. Before I give the floor to the first speaker, allow me please a few words about the concept of this webinar. We want to open the discussion on minority feminism at the Mediterranean borders and its surrounding areas, as is the Balkans, the Caucasus, the Iberian Peninsula, the Anatolia, the North Africa. We would like to engage with a comparative setting upon critical deconstruction of patriarchies defaced through the colonial feminist struggles and possibilities. By putting the decolonial at stake for Basque, Kurdish, Mizrahi, Black Tunisian, or other plural feminism, we are locating the intersectional social struggles around gender, ethnicity, minority, class, and race at the center of this discussion. We also pay attention to those feminism praxis for social equality and emancipation, to their creative return to the local knowledges and cosmologies, to their embodied habits as social agents engaging with mainstream and global feminism discourses for advocacy, human rights, as well as for challenges posed by art and digital technology. The Greek feminism, as the other kind of feminism, whether it is characterized as white, hegemonic, radical, liberal, activist, or academic, should turn their attention, I think, to those minority decolonial feminism, feminist agendas and voices, as well as to other counter-publics and creative initiatives facing discrimination, racism, inequality, and contempt. I think a micro is open. Can you please? Okay. A decolonized feminism is not simply an annex of minority voices to an existing project. It is a reconsideration of feminism through these voices, acknowledging the limitation of white feminism in considering their struggles. At the same time, it questions the existing representations of colonized women that have effectively invisible them throughout history, while also providing the tools and practices to address inequalities and exceed them in praxis from a position of agency in the local communities and their social struggles. This webinar is a follow-up of the thematic Decolonizing Gender and Feminist Methodologies We started at the symposium of our initiative, Decolonize, the last 2 months ago, where we opened this discussion on the occasion of the Kurdish women struggles and on everyday life and their feminist agendas and methodology. Today, we turn our attention to the Mizrahi feminism in Israel and the Basque feminism in the Iberian Peninsula, because we believe in this way we are setting an interesting comparative context to discuss the minority status and the gender perspective emerging through multiple discriminations and exclusion that shape a palimpsest of patriarchy based on social inequality, race, language, religion, cultural repression, settler colonialism, national borders, state nationalism and bureaucracy, white male supremacy and structural violence, epistemicide, etc. Patriarchy as a matrix of coloniality inscribes multiple submissions, consent, subversions, and revolts beyond those inscribed to female bodies as the first colonized ones. Following the path of such minority feminist praxis, struggling with specific patriarchal complexities, we could multiply our reflexive and decolonial stance on gender and feminist methodologies and go beyond the advocacy of identity rights or the performative activism on stage or within digital spaces. So now I'm ready to give the floor to our guest speaker, first guest speaker, Smadar Lavie. As I said, Smadar is a professor of anthropology, emerita at UC Davis. And we know her from her ethnography, The Last One Wrapped in the Flag of Israel, Mizrahi Single Mothers and Bureaucratic Torture. She received an honorable mention of the Association of Middle East Women's Studies. Also, Lavie Smadar, who tonight speaks about the title of her presentation is Who Can Publish the Colonized Autohistoria Theoria with the Anger It Deserves? Unclassified Laronas, if I pronounce
Yoronas,
well. Yoronas, Mizrahi feminists and the academic test. So, Smadar, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for coming at this stage of the pandemic when we are all so, we have so much Zoom fatigue and we've all become Zoom zombies. I'm going to read my paper and then give you some explanation in the middle, since I have more time, about Mizrahi feminism. Though it mainly has to do with ethnographic authority and decoloniality. On October 16, 2009, while temping at UVA Women's Studies Department, I attended a lecture by Brenda Bose, then an associate professor of English at the Hindu College of Delhi University. The lecture was titled The Transnational Trials of Taslima Nasreen. Trained as a physician, Nasreen is a Bangladeshi feminist who has written an impressive opus on women's oppression under South Asian Islam. She was forced into exile in Sweden due to the multiple fatwas calling for her death. Bose delivered her post-colonial lecture in Oxbridge English and Asari. As I listened to Nasreen's globe-trotting, my mind wandered to the logistics of it all. Is Bose a product of India's elite British schools? Who paid for her Oxbridge? Nasreen seemed to be on the global south to north traveling star circuit. Who's financing all of this? Even refugees need to pay a hefty fee to be smuggled across borders. Are they middle class? Who can afford to be mobile these days? Yet these kinds of speakers and their topics are in high demand in northern universities because they speak the language of academe, not the transnational language of Gloria and Saldua. So let me talk now about the Faculty Club and its movement north to south. Many professors in major universities in the global south belong to the upper-class cosmopolitan national elite. They are either well-versed in English or have the funds to translate their scholarship to English, the tyrannical language of academic quotation and promotion. These professors are eager, or perhaps feel obliged, to apply the US-UK formula for academic publication. The formula requires substantiating the anthropological argument's authenticity through the deployment of field snippets. These snippets emanate from the vagaries of daily life, ethnographic examples to decorate theories authored in the US European elite universities. As a result, these scholars are perceived by their North American colleagues as women of color scholars from the global South, who might replace the in-house American scholars of color from the ghetto or barrio. But what about grassroots indigenous or migrant non-academic organic teoria? The Global South faculty often conceives of this teoria as an unruly frontier of thought to be tamed or contained in first-tier English journals or university press monographs. Networking with editorial board members in annual international association meetings at five-star hotels might be of assistance as well. US European faculty, however, often perceive these Global South faculty texts that treat non-academic theoreticians as informants to be emancipatory. Their authors, brave interlocutors between the Ivy League and the subaltern of the field. This domino effect appropriation is laid out in Norma Alarcón formative text, The Theoretical Subjects of This Bridge Called My Back and Anglo-American Feminism. John Gledhill has argued that the US-UK Anthropological Journal and book formula and its Northern conventions, and I'm quoting from him, of research, writing, and thinking about the world, has low tolerance for an ethnographer doubling as an indigenous key informant who theorizes rather than just tells stories. The anthropologist should not have near complete overlap between her ethnographic experience and the personal and communal biography. Feminist and cultural studies scholarship follows and instructs the scholar to avoid the victim narrative. The subaltern subject writing in the US-UK formula is expected to produce dispassionate scholarship, no wailing, no anger. Faye Harrison offers a way out, and I'm quoting, the transformed anthropology would recognize that although the profession's institutional centers have been dominated by British, American, and French axes of authority, the intellectual life of the discipline has extended well beyond the North's major metropolitan centers to a variety of sites typically devalued as peripheral zones of theory around the world. Yet her solution does not address the multi-layered appropriation operation spelled out by Alarcón. US-UK elite Ivy League anthropologists and their Global South constituents who depend on them for reference and tenure letters create a body of scholarship, one that superimposes itself upon the subaltern rather than horizontally dialoguing with her. In recent years, US-UK anthropology has diversified in forms of theoretical argumentation and in various genres of ethnographic writing. But this diversity, let alone an ethnographer having a near complete overlap between her ethnographic experience and personal and communal biography, rarely appears in top-tier US-UK journals or scholarly presses. Take, for example, Ruth Bahar. Despite her class privilege, she used herself as key informant through creative writing about disenfranchised Latinas. She was clearly the anthropologist coming from Princeton and Ann Arbor, so she did not threaten her upper middle class colleagues. Even then, her more creative writings rarely appear in top-tier anthropology journals. Autoethnographer Zora Neale Hurston never published her story of being an independent scholar living in dire poverty in top journals or academic presses. She died virtually abandoned and destitute at age 69. How ironic and tragic that she only achieved acclaim for works such as Their Eyes Were Watching God years after her death. Anzaldúa died at age 62 from lack of adequate medical care. Oh, I'm sorry, what's going on here? Just a second. Oi, oi, oi. Her monumental autoethnography, Borderlands La Frontera, was published by Ant Lut, a small, underfunded feminist press, because larger university presses deemed it incomprehensible. The University of California posthumously bestowed upon her a long-deserved PhD. In fact, the US Euro-centered decolonization of anthropology has actually led to further colonization of the discipline because it was mainly unidirectional. Theory continues to be formulated and articulated in US European metropolitan universities, and that the data, now decolonized, continues to come from the third world or third worlded Western metropolises. So let me propose an alternative model for writing up Southern women's lives, decolonized, and it is a conocimiento model, and it has, to my mind, addressed better the stuff of life. Gloria Anzaldúa followed the path of Audre Lorde, who 35 years ago wrote The Uses of Anger, Women Responding to Racism, where she advocates for the articulation of raw anger in academic texts. I'm quoting, the anger of exclusion, of unquestioned privilege, of racial distortions, of silence, ill use, stereotyping, defensiveness, misnaming, betrayal, and cooptation, end quote. Lorde argues that anger in academic language should retain emotional power because it is, and I'm quoting, a liberating and strengthening act of clarification, end quote. She discusses the multivocal orchestration of anger as text, and I'm quoting again, women of color in America have grown up within a symphony of anger, of being silenced, being unchosen, at knowing that when we survive, it is in spite of a world that takes for granted our lack of humanness. And I say symphony rather than cacophony, because we have had to learn to orchestrate those furies, end quote. Anzaldúa's conocimiento model argues the articulation of raw emotions through the 7 stages of aftershock, the in-between, despair, call for action, putting the pieces together and testing them, rebirth, and spiritual activism. This model accurately depicts the life cycle of subaltern racialized women and lends itself to contextual cross-cultural comparisons. For years, Anzaldúa's path-breaking autohistoria teoria framework was trivialized as only testimony, but we have shifted. Frontera was published by Ant Lut, Light in the Dark by Duke University Press. Conocimiento, and I'm now quoting, requires that you encounter your shadow side and confront what you've programmed yourself and have been programmed by your culture to avoid confronting the traits and habits distorting how you see reality and inhabiting the full use of your facultad, end quote. Anzaldúa's agency cannot be separated from the shadow beast, as the pair's enactment involves not only courage but fear. The rigid US-UK formula standardizes the explication of the stuff of life, but Anzaldúa allows for a range of non-standardized arguments illuminated and interconnected from within what Michael Taussig termed their epistemic murk. Aside from the English barrier, it is the very narration of these intrinsic interconnections from within the murk that has led to the stymieing of Anzaldúan genres during the anonymous review process of major US-UK journals and scholarly presses. Anzaldúa's conocimiento model calls for a reconceptualization of the relationships among communities of subaltern scholarly knowledge. She calls for the replacement of monological and unidirectional anthropology by multivocal autohistoria and autoethnographia that paves the way for a more creative and egalitarian environment embedded in inchoate communities. Her analytical categories engage the local. For her, the local is not data to be ethnographed in English language metropolitans, but theory that refuses to adhere to the US-UK pretense of analytical coherence. Analdua refuses to reappropriate informant's vignettes as she generalizes her model. And let me quote, La Mestiza constantly has to shift out of habitual formations from convergent thinking, analytical reasoning that tends to use rationality to move toward a single goal, a Western model, to divergent thinking characterized by movement away from set of patterns and goals and toward a more whole perspective, one that includes rather than excludes, end quote. Now let's see how La Llorona, or the wailing woman, Teoria, travels to Israel and Palestine. Before that, let me give you some demographics that most people outside Israel are unaware of. The Israeli citizen body is divided to three main groups. One of them is the Palestinians, who are citizens. They're 20%, and they are a remnant of a much larger population that was expelled in 1948 to make room for the Jewish state in mandatory Palestine. 50%, the majority, are Mizrahim, or Easterners. We are Jews who started arriving as cheap labor since 1882, mainly from Arab countries, Muslim countries, and the non-Yiddish speaking margins of the Ottoman empires, Greek, Southern Italy, Bulgaria, former Yugoslavia, etc. Both Mizrahim and Palestinians with Israeli citizenship are dominated by a minority group of Ashkenazim. These are Jews originating in Europe, and their category is mainly linguistic. They come from Yiddish-speaking cultures and countries. They birthed Zionism, which is a colonial ideology of settling Jews in Palestine and making Palestine, as they call it, a villa in the jungle. And they basically control culture, mainstream culture, and power in Israel. Mizrahi feminists find themselves squished between Ashkenazi feminists and Palestinian feminists, because the world is familiar with Israel through the Israel-Palestine conflict. In Israel, however, as a Jew, doing pro-Palestine work is part of Ashkenazi privilege. So basically, it's the elite Ashkenazim who get funded for projects that have to do with justice to Palestine, who talk with the elite English-speaking Palestinian women, while ignoring the needs and well-being in everyday life of the majority women in Israel who are Mizrahim, where the main agenda is basically housing, inalienable right for our children, healthcare, proper education, personal safety, occupation, employment rights, and basically everything that has to do with everyday living. So we find ourselves in a sense crushed between the Ashkenazim and the Palestinians, because so much of Israeli culture is not directed inward but outside, as far as getting funds from outside foundations, mainly progressive Jewish foundations. And the only thing that they're interested in is the Palestine conflict, while our argument is that nothing is going to be solved without the votes of the Mizrahi majority. The Mizrahi majority, meanwhile, is constantly moving to the right wing because there is a big housing crisis in Israel. The only housing available at reasonable prices is in the West Bank settlement. And because of that, there is this kind of weird dialogic relationship between a community that find its solution in the right wing, while the majority of Mizrahi feminists are left of center. And we have to put our identification and solidarity with the Palestinians on the back burner if we want to have access to our communities and improve their lives. So that's our dilemma. So let me talk more now about our dilemma and as it reflects in anthropology. While Lord focuses on anger, one of Anzaldua's main figures, La Llorona, and I'm quoting, a woman who wails, a site of intersection, connection, and cultural transgression, end quote. Betrayed for actually it's more quotes, betrayed for generations, traumatized by racial denigration and exclusion. We are almost buried by grief's heavy fall. We never forget our wounds. La Llorona, our dark mother, with her perpetual mournful song, our symbol of unresolved grief, an ever-present specter in our psyche. So La Llorona's wailing in the night for her lost children has an echoing note in the wailing or mourning rites performed by women. As they bid their sons, brothers, and husbands goodbye, wailing is a Chicana woman's feeble protest when she has no other recourse. This collective wailing rites, a sign of resistance in a society which glorified the warrior and war, and for whom the women were just a body. This is Anzaldúa. After an impressive genealogy of struggle, North American women faculty of color are finally gaining the ability to express emotions in their academic publications and write in mixed genre, as long as they have tenure. Nevertheless, this feat remains impossible for middle to lower middle class women scholars from the global south, such as Palestinians with Israeli citizenship and Mizrahim. Mizrahim are Jews from the Arab and Muslim world and margins of the Ottoman Europe and are Israel's demographic majority at 50%. Palestinians with Israeli citizenship are about 20% of Israel's citizenry, and Ashkenazim, Jews originating from Yiddish-speaking countries, are only 30%, but control the division of power and privilege in the state. Mizrahi women don't fall under the North American classification of women of color. We are expected to use the US-UK formula of dispassionate scholarship because the underlying assumption is that we are elite. Our parents paid for our expensive Ivy League PhDs. My parents drilled me and I drilled my son to get straight A's because our only way to get an education was OPM, other people's money, or performance-based scholarships. No affirmative action for Mizrahim in America. Mizrahi feminists who opt out of Zionism are caught in the Palestine-Israel binarism and the US-UK formula. We are prevented from articulating the in-between, be it W.E.B. Du Bois between me and the world, or Chela Sandoval's delineation of the space between Fanon, black skin, and white mask. We are not allowed Lord Anger or Anzalduan wailing. Abroad, we are Israeli Jews. In Israel, we're troublemakers. If we sell out, we might fit into the well-funded disciplines of Israeli and Jewish studies. If we don't, we still can't benefit from the welcome boom of critical publications on the Israel-Palestine binary. We are not Arab Jews either. That is a historical concept that ceased to exist with the foundation of the Israeli state in 1948. And at any rate, our own communities loathe the term. They're right-wing. We fall into silence when we refuse the containment enforced on our critique of Zionism in the name of Israeli ethnic diversity. For us, Zionism is racism. We fall into silence when we upset the Palestinian national narrative, whose secular academic intelligentsia dialogues with the upper class, post or anti-Zionist Ashkenazi elites. We debunk, so we wail. Progressive North American feminists of color and Anglo feminists alike, stuck in the Israel-Palestine binary, label our wailing polemics. Our work are stymied from the global circulation of feminists of color texts. We Mizrahi feminists encompass the shadow beast and facultad, Ashkenazi mainstream and its Mizrahi capos, judge everyone speaking about intra-Jewish race relations guilty of lahid bachyen. In Hebrew, this means whining and being a crybaby. The term lahid bachyen is usually deployed by those articulating what is advertised as, quote unquote, the Israeli discourse of pluralist enlightenment, end quote. It is part of the Pearsonian analytical paradigm of universalism particularism, so prevalent in the analysis of Israeli society. The Ashkenazim are the true Israelis, therefore universalists. We are left with divisive ethnic particularism. Good examples for the evocation of lahid bachyen is the Ashkenazi Zionist across-the-board denial of the kidnapping of Mizrahi babies from 1930s to the early 70s and their subsequent selling for adoption to Ashkenazim. Or the ringworm children affair, when about 150,000 Mizrahi children were irradiated with high-dose X-rays without their parents' consent or knowledge. Israel, founded on mandatory Palestine, conceives of itself as a national home of all world Jewry. Aren't all Jews assumed equal in the homeland of the Jews? But members of Israel's Mizrahi majority find it next to impossible to present any case for racial discrimination in court. Their cases are almost always disarmed and stripped of legitimacy by accusation of lahid bachyen. So let me end by reading you a Mizrahi wail and putting it in context. On March 20th, 2005, the Mizrahi Democratic Rainbow NGO held a book launch to celebrate Aaron Itzhaki's book, The Mask, Introduction to Ethnic Strategy in the State of Israel, Comparative Research. This self-published tome discusses, among other topics, the compliance of Israeli leftist academia with the regime and its apartheid toward Mizrahim. The book refers to Israeli university social sciences and humanities professors as mercenaries of the pen. Likewise, the book dwells on the docility and lackluster thinking required of Mizrahi intellectuals, male by default, to get a foot in Israeli academia's doors. If they are well behaved, they will gain entry. During the discussion, out stood fierce young Mizrahi feminist. Here is her wail. Their racism towards us has gotten so sophisticated in the university. They used to totally shut me up, labeling me as mitbachyenet mikzoit, one who made wailing about racial issues into an expertise. But I've had it with their kissing ass to the Palestinians, as if our resistance needs a kosher stamp from them, the Palestinians, to be valid. Now they pretend they're listening to our wails. Unlike the Palestinians, we're not a category for teaching about social justice or human rights in the law school curriculum. We belong in their anthropology and folklore departments. As Jews, under the law, we have equal rights. But when I insist I am a legal category of race-related discrimination, they just mumble around so we can move on. I'm the only loudmouth Mizrahi in the classroom, and they're just waiting to see how long it will take me to get worn out or sell out. Enough with this tying everything to the Palestinians. Let them cling to their Ashkenazim, whose racism towards us is now all but undetectable. In my parents' time, it was plain as day. Now we need X-ray vision to see it. That's how we're losing the younger generation. They see racism as just over because if you see it, it hurts like hell. It's so subtle and so cruel, like cuts in the live flesh, and you can't see the blood. It is my hope that the unclassified grassroots Anzalduan scholar from the global south can shift, that she is no longer given the default elite status, that she is able to publish academically through the conocimiento model of bearing witness to herself and society. This might horizontalize the power dynamics between and among feminists of color in US European elite academe, feminist faculty in the global south, and grassroots feminist intellectuals from the global south. To lend myself to Faye Harrison's vision, we need to listen to, read, and quote feminist theory from ex-centric sites and break away from the Anglophone dominance of scholarship. Given that we cannot undo the tyranny of English, now let us shift to translation. Let us shift to the transnational language of Gloria and Satu.
Thank you, Smadar, for this presentation. We are very challenging and a lot of issues you raised. I'm sure we are going to discuss. And let me give the floor to our discussant, Sisi Theodosiou, for some first comments before we pass to the second speaker.
Right, thank you very much, Smadar. As always, your thought is very thought-provoking for me. I'm not very familiar with the whole kind of feminist bibliography, but I suppose since the whole kind of gender, race, nation assemblage you are discussing in your work, since the gender issue is always very central to the assemblage you're discussing in your work, I suppose this is the kind of point, and my entry point to your thought, to your talk. Right, okay. What you're talking in a way made me think is how we can push our thinking beyond the binary between the US-UK formula of post-colonial feminist scholarship and the decolonial feminist framework that highlights the lived experience of women of color from the global South, and how through your talk, or how your talk forces us to reflect again on ideas such as authorship, decoloniality, and the key decolonial idea of how thinking is inevitably located. If decolonial feminist theory values all knowledge and lived experiences as equal, and provides a new framework within the geopolitics of knowledge production, by bringing to the fore the unclassified women of color experience, whether they are Mizrahi grassroots feminists or Mizrahi scholars, your presentation touched upon very significant issues at the core of today's topic, which is minority feminisms, and their struggle to engage with the dominant feminist critique, to find their own path to emancipation and to make their voices heard. There are many things that I find fascinating about your overall work, and I think your overall work is very much reflected in what you presented today. And they all share a way of thinking that goes against the mainstream academic grain and towards a way of understanding the everydayness of in-between worlds, worlds full of uncertainties, ambiguities, and contradictions, and yet full of potential to unravel the cracks of the colonial statecraft in Israel. First of all, I have always been fascinated by the way in which your own personal life story has been intricately intertwined with your academic interests, how, in other words, your personal milieu becomes political. I have also been fascinated by the challenging interconnections you draw between what you call ominous hyphens, Arab Jews, the Mizrahi, and the Palestinian Israelis, by focusing especially on the way the volatile gender, race, nation assemblage of the Israeli state apparatus is forced upon them. How, in other words, as you put it in another article of yours about staying put in their hyphenated identities, how stay put is a kind, it can be seen as a radical act. It's specifically in this context that we discuss South to South feminist coalitions, not as discursive contracts, but as involuntary time spaces that are lived somatically. And I find this idea very fascinating, that I would like you to perhaps elaborate a bit more on that later. Thirdly, you resisted questioning of the feminist ethnographic traditions of discourse by examining the limits encountered by feminist postcolonial methodology and theory in their attempt to describe the lives in border zone traumas, and your search for ways to explicate the unspeakable experiences that go beyond discourse, and to develop a decolonial feminist ethnography that engages with the politics of power and positionality. All these strings together bring you closer to Gloria's and Zaldua's work as an auto-ethnographer of her own culture. In a way, you are also an auto-ethnographer of your own culture. Her auto-historia theoria framework, and especially her model, conocimiento, I cannot even pronounce it. Sorry.
Conocimiento.
Yes, calls for a replacement of this kind of Cartesian order by the local, but this kind of local that is not just data, ethnographic data that we as anthropologists need to theorize, but theory that refuses to somehow adhere to the Western analytical coherence. I wonder actually whether you would like to tell us more about how what is for you very kind of challenging and promising in using this autotheoria framework, and about how speaking about Mizrahi women, how do you see, I mean, whether you see a possibility or impossibility of them occupying this kind of third space that Anj Altua talks about. I have more questions, I suppose, but I wouldn't really like to take up more time. Would you like to share a comment now, or would you like to discuss more later on?
I think I took enough time, so perhaps we need to move to the next presentation and then conjoin. But I'm sending you heartfelt gratitude for your critical read of my work. Thank you so much.
Well, not exactly critical reading. I just tried to kind of sum up what I really like about your work. Of course, I would love to hear more about the whole kind of Mizrahi single mothers kind of dilemma there, and all these kind of Mizrahi feminism kind of being squashed, as you said before, between the Ashkenazi feminism and the whole kind of Palestinian feminism. But we will see what the audience also would like to hear. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Cici. And so we can keep some keywords of your presentation, if I may add some in the critique and the reading, in the critical reading Cici made of your presentation also. I would keep the Mizrahi couple concept, we would like to analyze a little bit more. And of course, autoethnografia, autohistoria, and the famous cononciamento model as a multi-model to deconstruct the epistemic mark. I think we should return to these categories and concepts and to elaborate a little bit more. So now we can pass to the second speaker, who is Maggie Bullen. She's anthropologist in the Department of Philosophy of Values at the University of Basque Countries. And she's specialized, I would say, on Basque gender studies, if I can tell this. And she's working currently on a project on new solidarities, reciprocities, and alliances, the emergence of collaborative spaces of political participation and a definition of citizenship, funded by the Spanish Ministry of Economy, Industry and Competitivity. The title of her presentation is Circles Within Circles, Decolonizing the Decolonial in the Basque Feminist Movement. So Maggie, the floor is yours. Your micro, please.
I think I had been on silence. Okay, thank you very much, Fotini. I'd like to share my screen as I won't be reading a paper, but rather talking to PowerPoint.
It's fine, Maggie, yeah. You are a co-host now, so you can share your screen.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I think everybody can see that now, and I'd just like to begin by saying very many thanks to Fotini and all the colleagues, companions of the Decolonize Hellas movement, which is really interesting. And I'm really pleased to be able to be part of that with you. So very many thanks to Fotini for the invitation to organizing this, but also very many thanks to my PhD student, Katerina Sergidou, who's there with us this afternoon. Without her, I wouldn't know you, I wouldn't have contact with you. And this is a very exciting thing because it's through sharing the PhD between our university in the Basque Country and her university in Athens that we're able to today have this really enriching time of talking to each other. And I'm sorry in a way that we have to speak in English because this is the ultimate colonial act. And I'm sorry that I'm the native English speaker here. I'm actually speaking from Great Britain today. Thank you for all your patience with English, and thank you for your brilliant English, because I'm afraid I know no word of Greek. But so thank you to you all. I've entitled my talk today, Circles Within Circles and Decolonizing the Decolonial in the Basque Feminist Movement, as Fotini has already said. So I just wanted to situate you all in the Basque Country. I'm not sure how much you know Spain or France. I know there's a few friends here this afternoon from the Basque Country, but maybe it's in other parts of the world as I myself am right now. But as you can see in the map on the left, we see the Iberian Peninsula joining there onto the foot of France, where the Pyrenees cross right through the middle. And the little colored section then is the section that we call Euskal Herria. Euskal Herria being the Basque Country. But I'd just like to say that when we say the Basque Country, it means the country of Basque, because the Euskal refers to the language. So the Basque language is Euskera, and Euskal would be the adjective referring to the language. So that just shows us the importance of the Basque language for Basque identity. And another point I would like to make at this juncture is that you see on this map 7 provinces that make up the idea of Euskal Herria. So this is in the sense of Benedict Anderson, an imagined community. It doesn't exist as a political entity today, but rather as different entities. So part of them are situated in Iparralde, which means the north side. So those are the 3 provinces that you can see, which are on the French side. So rather than talk about France, which would be to recognize the nation state of France, people who imagine their country as these 7 in one, as these 7 provinces making up Euskal Herria, like to talk about the French state and the Spanish state, to recognize that they are necessarily part of that state, but they themselves see themselves as another nation, a stateless nation. So it's important how they name their territory, how they name their country. So we've said the language, but by talking about the north side and the south side, about Iparralde, north, Hegoalde, the south, we're also erasing discursively that barrier that runs through the part of the Pyrenees, that runs dividing these 2 states. And this is important for what I want to talk about today, because it feeds in to ideas of feminism, and it can't be separated from the whole idea of the colonial and the decolonial, because as soon as we're talking about Euskal Herria, we're talking about a colonized territory within Europe, historically colonized on both sides by the French state, by the Spanish state, and a territory where this is still today no more fought over with arms, but fought over in many different areas of our lives. And one of it is through language as well, through whether we speak in Euskera or whether we speak in French or Spanish, or even like today, speak in English. So I think it's also really important, as Fotini said in her introduction to our session today, that we're talking about multiple discriminations. And I'd like to underline that, because so often when we think about decolonial theory, we're thinking about Europe having colonized other parts of the world. And here we have, and there are many other realities where it's within Europe, so an intra-European colonization. And that has to be, we can't ignore that when we're thinking about decolonial proposals within the French or Spanish states, within the Basque Country. So we're not talking, we can't, it's not black and white, it's not European or non-European. We can't even divide it according to the color of people's skin. So it goes on at all sorts of other levels. So that's another point that I'd like to make. And so hence I think it's important that we situate the Basque feminist movement in, I'm going to be talking mainly, if not wholly, about the Basque feminist movement in Egoalde on the Spanish side. And I'm going to be situating it in its relation to Spain. And here I've just put up, although there isn't very much written in English, there are some things, but the work that I'd like to mention today, Fotini kindly mentioned my manual on Basque gender studies, which has a chapter at the end about Basque feminist movement. And I'm happy that with today's talk, it's prompting me to rewrite and update that chapter. But three main books that perhaps we should mention here if we want to look at the histories of the Basque feminist movement. So 2008, we have Movimiento de Mujeres, Mujeres en Movimiento, so the movement of women or women in movement by Begoña Zavala. Another really important work that's in Basque, meaning our feminist genealogies, a chronicle of the feminist movement in the Basque Country by Edurne Epelde, Miren Aranguren eta Andirache Tolaza. And then a very recent piece of work that's just been presented in November in Donosti, San Sebastián, hasn't yet been published, but will soon come to light. And that's the Crónica de los primeros años del movimiento feminista en Donostia. So chronicle of the first years of the feminist movement in Donostia, 1976 to 1982. And that was presented just recently in November in the Museum of San Telmo. That's the picture that you have on your right, by feminists who I think we could call veteran feminists of the movement, Carmen Diez, Miren Garmendia, and Begoña Gorospe. So here we have a lot of work that's gathering in this history, and there are of course a lot of colleagues in feminist history whose work is also important. But I just wanted to mention those three specifically, having documented the feminist movement. And then I'd like to mention another book that I'm going to be drawing on this afternoon. This is Feminism and Transformations in Politics, and by Mariluz Esteban. It's been translated, she originally wrote it in Basque, so it's been translated into Spanish and also into Catalan, not yet into English. But this is probably the most, well, apart from the one I've just mentioned, a recent book, and this gives us a very succinct and analytical vision of the feminist movement in the Basque Country. Mariluz Esteban's the director of our feminist anthropology research group in the University of the Basque Country. So I'll be drawing on some of these books as I talk today. And although when I thought up a title for this book, I was thinking of well, I thought of circles within circles as the idea of that we have a colonial history in the Basque Country. We now have another layer of critique from people who've come from outside of the Basque Country, from other places of the world to live in the Basque Country, who are challenging the colonial character of our society. And there's a general clamor to decolonialize our realities, our education, our feminist practice. So I was thinking of circles in that sense. But when I went back to Esteban's book, she entitles one of the chapters at the beginning as a movement that spread like ripples in the water, giving us a different metaphor from the usual one of the waves. Now we talk about feminism in terms of waves, first, second, third, and nowadays we're talking about the fourth wave. Esteban considers that waves, even though we live on the, not in fact on the Mediterranean coast, but on the Cantabrian coast, where the waves are big and rough, that she wants to defend the idea of a unity within a feminist movement that at the same time is plural and sometimes fragmented and sometimes a stage for discussion, for tension, perhaps even as Smadar was suggesting, for anger, but that it's a movement that spreads and it's a movement that maintains its unity. So perhaps this idea of ripples, of circles in a piece of water could give us another way of thinking. Of course, metaphors are our metaphors. They're not the reality itself, and they're there to help us think or imagine the reality we want to address. So I just want to go back to situate you in what we were up against, what the early feminist movement was up against in the 20th century. As you know, large amount of the 20th century was controlled by the dictator Franco, and it was a totally sexist and patriarchal society where women were subordinate and where there was a national promotion of the idea of the good wife. No, women could only exist as wives and mothers. Their experience in the workplace was hugely restricted. Once they were married, they weren't allowed to work. And this, you can see the rest of this picture. It's, although it's in Spanish, I think you'll understand from the pictures very easily, these 11 rules to keep your husband happy and to be the wife that he always dreamt of. So this really is, if it hadn't been real, it would be funny, but many women had to actually live this reality. So that was the idea, that you lived for your husband, that you had nothing to say, that you should listen to him, that you should make him happy, that you should cook for him. The Franco regime was all about the family and the mother's role within the family, and that women had nothing to say, no place. So, however, before that, even it's not that there hadn't ever been any women protesting and asking for liberty. And in fact, the years before the Franco regime, the years of the Spanish Republic, were really active years when a lot of socially progressive reforms were made and demands making. And this was also true even before the Republic in the Basque Country. There were very strong women in the Basque nationalist movement who might have been conservative in their nationalism, conservative in their political thinking, but they were women who started to have an active role in public speaking, and some of them were actually put in jail for that. So although we can't go into the full history today, I just wanted to give you those ideas that This goes back a long way of women fighting not only for their freedom, but for a political freedom as well. So when we come to the notion of the feminist movement, so Franco dies in 1975, and the Spanish state enters a period of transition up till 1978. And this is a time, although towards obviously the 1960s is a time when in the world things are changing rapidly for women. And in the 60s, there begin to be slight murmurs, but it's not really till the death of Franco in 1975 when feminism erupts onto the streets in this kind of demonstration. And here their banner says, for men, no more than their rights, and for women, nothing less than their rights. So here were the women appearing, erupting on the streets from this time on. And Teresa del Valle, who was an anthropologist who founded the whole School of Basque Gender Studies in our university and in the Basque Country, she names 3 events as talks about hitos or milestones, which she takes the metaphor from the stones that actually mark the borders. And she uses this as a heuristic device for thinking about marking points, marking stones in our memory. So when we look back and see what are the main things that were important in the history of the Basque feminist movement, Teresa del Valle points to 3. And one of these is the trial of what became known as the Basauri 11 in 1979. So 10 women were put on trial for having aborted, plus the doctor who practiced the abortion. And they were put on trial, and there was such a protest against this. So you can see in the photo of the streets, people came out on the streets. So it was a massive show of feminist anger against a state that was repressing women and a demand for them to have control over their own bodies. Apart from the Basauri 11, the next point that Del Valle points to are the 3 feminist conferences of Leioa. Leioa is where part of our university is in Vizcaya near Bilbao. And so the first was in 1977. These are photos from there. 1984 and 1994. So these were major conferences in which the big themes of the day were discussed, from the issues of abortion, sexuality, control over our bodies, also work, the right to work, the right to be in the public space, the right to be more than a mother. That was some of the issues that were debated and discussed. And there was also time for fiesta. Now, here they are afterwards with their accordions. So another important point is that celebratory aspect, the protest, the anger, but also the celebration. And the third point that Del Valle wants to makes a milestone of the issues of the alardes or parades of Irún and Hondarribia. This is much more recent, at the end of the 20th century. But here we have a case that's been the subject of a lot of my research in recent years, in the last 25 years, where a group of women want to take part in a festival that's been dominated by men, and they're not allowed to, and they're still not allowed to. And so this, 25 years ago, Del Valle saw what was going on, and she said, this is going to be one of those milestones. This is something that shows that we still haven't got equality. And although it's in the traditional, so you have those banners at the back are saying the traditional alarde. And I think this is also important to point, although it's not part of that history, it's how the history is involved in so many areas, so many things have been achieved, but there is still this enclave of resistance. But then to look at what's going on in feminism today, using the alarde as the little bridge to bring us forward, we can see that the history of that movement that is told in the books I've mentioned at the beginning comes together. There were different assemblies, there were different conferences, societies, groups, that many of them come together in the Basque feminist collective called Euskal Herriko Bilgune Feminista, founded in 2002. This is important because of the generation change. So we've got, up till now, I've talked about a period from the end of the 20th century, and here we're into the 21st century, and things are changing, society's changing. And although this isn't the whole of the feminist movement, it's a big part of it. And Esteban in her book points to this. And although she's recognizing the difference, the point of her book is that she wants to, one of the points that she wants to show in the Basque feminist movement is that despite the discussions, despite the differences, despite the variety of realities and types of women and types of demands, we can recognize a feminist movement that moves together. And she calls it unitario, not to be unitary. She says to be unitary is to have the capacity to act together. And so like leads us or encourages us to look at action, at acting together rather than just the theory of it all. So as we move then into the 21st century, the society's changing and we've got new challenges. So we've got a financial crisis which has affected the world, not to mention our recent pandemic, but also the failure of the democratic transition in the Spanish state, one that promised to hand out equality in political terms, but that hasn't. We have in the Basque case then, we have the end of the arms struggle, and that's led to a new context, to new conditions for acting, for negotiating, a new period that is characterized by hope, but there's also certain tiredness, uncertainty, and feeling of impasse. And here I'm using Esteban's words as well. And then we must add that in recent years, we have increased immigration. It's traditionally been a country where we can have to say two kinds of immigration, really. And this is another point when we're thinking about what the decolonial means, because over the years from the Spanish Civil War and through the years of Franco's dictatorship, many people moved from other parts of Spain that were war-torn, impoverished, and came to either the Basque Country or Catalonia for work. These were the big industrial areas of Spain. And there is even a theory out there that Franco didn't develop the rest of Spain in order to let all these people kind of flood the regions with very strong nationalist identities, with their own languages and cultures, to flood them with Spanish speakers, Spanish people of Spanish cultural background, because his idea was that Spain would be one and great. And so as well as women's subordination, as well as the prohibition of the language, everything to do with being Basque was forbidden during those Franco times. So we also have a whole history of immigration into the Basque Country from other parts of Spain. And then we have another kind of immigration that comes from outside of the Iberian Peninsula, mostly from Latin America, because of course Spain was the colonizer of a great part of Latin America. And nowadays we have a whole new kind of migration that's coming from Africa with the current migrant crisis. And what does this mean for feminism? Esteban encouraged us to look in the face of these huge structural problems. He encourages us, but also identifies in feminism the continual focus on personal transformations, both on but also in the political and economic spheres. That she recognizes that social movements and concrete practices or actions are still where change is happening. And this is our recent research project on emergent social movements. And rather than looking on a great long scale far into the future, that through feminism, we're looking at short or medium term objectives with very concrete kinds of action. And that the work doesn't just go through demonstrations or pressure, but it's also one that's based on the way we live together, learning to live our differences. Also continues to be active in trade unionism and the working conditions, in its campaign against all kinds of sexist violence, the human rights of migrants and refugees, a new concept of what it means to be citizen, related also to what it means to be a Basque citizen, and then other issues of education, sexuality, and health. So I'm going to just dedicate the last part of my talk to this more recent, or the very recent, feminist scene, and in particular to an event which was the 5th Feminist Conference in Durango in 2019. It was called Salda, which means literally that there's soup. Salda is a kind of just clear consommé that people drink in the winter in the bars. Where they serve it, there's a sign up that says Salda Balago, so that you know that in that place you can get hot soup. So here they're using it as a metaphor, partly playing on the literal side. You can see with that wave part in the cup, like the storm in the teacup, storm in the teaspoon, the ideas of the traditional, rocking the traditional, challenging, but also meaning here we've got substance, here we've got something hot. And in this conference, although there were lots of things going on, and we could talk about it as how it represents the Basque feminist movement today, how it represents the generational change and the number of young people who've come into feminism, as well as the veterans who are there all together, but also a change in terms of what is popularly called intersectionality. Now, the idea of we have a more diverse society today than we ever have done in ethnic and racial terms, and that has brought into the Basque feminist movement the kind of issues that they have been fighting about for themselves. So issues about who they are, how they resist oppression, how they defend their identities, at the same time as how they fight against patriarchy. So this brings up, and it came up, the idea of who speaks on whose behalf, the dominant profile of person, of woman at Durango, as you can see in the picture, is white. But there was an attempt to include, to invite, to make sure that there were representatives of other decolonial groups or groups of women who define themselves in different ways. And I think there was a shift from the idea of people speaking against racism or speaking on behalf of other women, whether Indigenous or Gypsy women or women of other ethnic groups. So there was an idea of that, and an idea of needing to think about being white while at the same time as being Basque, but being white and in a different position of power than what perhaps women had thought that they were thinking about. Equality. Equality is another one of the characteristics that is usually brought when we're thinking about Basque culture. It's something that comes up as a defining characteristic of the Basques as being a people who have always tried to build their society on a horizontal structure of relationships. It's not a hugely class-based society, perhaps because it has been more wealthy from its industry, but also has big communities of fishing and rural people. So there's this idea of equality, and that's carried through into as a characteristic of the feminist movement. And at Saldabadago, at this conference, the feminist movement was confronted, and Smadar, I'd love to talk to you about this, because I think here we had an expression of anger by women who define themselves as racialized women, and a sense of uneasiness. There's some videos on YouTube that, if anybody wants to look them up, you can actually see them. There's a moment when they say they don't feel that this conference is a safe place. And that's shocking to the Basques, to the feminist movement, feeling that aren't we all feminists? Aren't we all together in our shared subordination? Aren't we as Basques also subjects of oppression, and therefore we can understand your oppression? Aren't we all in this together? Aren't we all sisters? Aren't we all women? And so this was a point that was important. I think we could say it somehow shook the foundations. It wasn't the first time that this had happened, but it was the first time it had happened on this scale. And yet the racialized women weren't the only ones. We also have the Basque Gypsy community. The Gypsy community itself is important in Spain. It's big. It suffers marginalization, suffers exclusion. The women suffer subordination, and yet there are movements as well. And here we have the performance of a Gypsy poet and singer who's there. So I just wanted to bring that into this, the plurality of what's going on. And just some of the themes. There's the theme of race comes up then, but also themes of work, of care, that most of the women from Latin America and from some of the African countries work caring for the elderly, for the sick, for the dependent. And at the same time, we've got another huge movement going on at the moment from the Basque people campaigning to improve their pension rights. And so on the left here, you've got the racialized women saying there won't be any pensions that are at all dignified until we have dignified the racialized workers. I'm coming towards the end. So these are there is now a network of women who call themselves the Network of Racialized Migrant Women in Euskal Herria. They use the name Euskal Herria. Many of them, some of them here from this group in the picture, many of them have lived in the Basque country a long time. Many of them have learned Basque. But interestingly, they've decided to form a group that's not mixed. So it's they only admit racialized women into their group. And at the moment, they're fighting for different causes, a lot of them revolving around the idea of work. So then what can we do? Are we condemned to go round in concentric circles? Or can these new challenges help us break out, help us find new points to continue to be this unified, to be unified within our plurality? And again, I just want to finish with some thoughts from Esteban's book, who says she wants to end on a positive note, thinking that there are so many things that we are doing in the feminist movement and that we should work on together to be able to make wise and complex diagnoses, to situate ourselves in the context, to know the context, know where we're coming from, as I've tried to show a little bit today. What is our context? What's our history? And not to be too theoretical. So often decolonial theory is very theoretical, and so encourages us to relate those to our context, to our practice, to our experience. And then I suppose it's thinking outside the box. How can we ask new questions rather than getting bogged down in our critique, in our anger, in our frustration, and design and implement new tactics, new strategies? How can we reach women and men who don't define themselves as feminists, as well as including feminists? How can we strengthen the associations there already are? How can we keep on pressurizing and negotiating with the institutions? There are lots of things going on in not only protests, but also creative things. There's a group of women called Bides Bide who work with migrant women. They do a lot of work trying to help them get their papers done. And yet they've also had a workshop where they've written their own decolonial poetry and had workshops presenting those. There's theatre, there's street performancing. There was a lot of collaboration with the World Women's March. So a lot of things that are happening, and at the same time there's action. But I'd just like to leave you with this idea, which again is from Esteban's book, and she draws on the idea from Lucretia Masson, and she calls it ruminant epistemology. And this ruminant epistemology invites us to stop and think as we would with the cows in the fields where Lucretia Masson grew up in Argentina. And these are some quotes here from that. It's inviting us to stop and think. I won't read it all, but towards the end it says the ruminant method is slow, lazy, unproductive, unsexy, big, excessive, thick-skinned, undainty, unrefined, walks slowly, is idle, slovenly, sloppy in its forms. And so perhaps this is an invitation to us to stop, to think, not to go, part of us is anger, part of us is emotion, part of us is action. And by doing together, we form that feminist movement. But if we're going to think about the decoloniality, we also need to stop and think together in order to go forward. Thank you very much. Eskerrik asko.
Thank you very much, Maggie, for this presentation. A lot of food for thought. We really love it. And now I'm giving the floor to Christina Grammatikopoulou as discussant to make some comments. Christina?
Hello. First of all, thank you for this great presentation. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to understand Basque feminism better, and also the issue of feminist decolonization. And from what we have already discussed, it becomes evident that as we pursue the decolonization of feminism, we consider also the Western civilization's role in the subjugation of the other. So this would include the exclusion mechanisms that perpetuate inequalities, such as the illegality of migrants, but also the existence of second-class citizens, something that was also highlighted in Smadar's presentation today, as well as the reorganization of the labor market in a way where former colonies produce value for Western companies, but they receive very little in exchange. So in addition to acknowledging contemporary colonialist practices, decolonizing feminism means to let the people who have been marginalized to take charge of their own representations, community building projects, and identity, as you have showed in your last slides. Now connecting to your previous work and your Basque Gender Studies book, I would like to highlight how interesting it is that you look into the subject from multiple perspectives. For example, you see how feminism is written into local traditions, like the matriarchy, or the traditions of the Alardes processions that you showed us, local legends that form part of the Basque identity, but are also part in other parts of Europe, like the witches, for example. You talk in your book about the identity of the witch, and this has also been extensively studied by Silvia Federici in connection to colonialism. But also you talk about how feminism is expressed in popular culture, like rock music. And of course, something which is, I will comment further on, is the connection to local nationalism. And you have a very great analysis on how feminism emerges during La Repubblica, and then civil war, and what happens during Francoism and the transition to democracy. So what I would, as I have also an experience of living in a part of Spain with a similar background like Catalonia, I thought that one interesting thing is the connection to the migrants. So, and how they are a minority within an already minoritarian group within Spain, as are the Basque people. Minoritarian in the sense that their language and tradition had been oppressed throughout recent history in 20th century. And there is a particularity that Maggie stressed in regard to colonialism and language when it comes to Spain. So in territories where Spanish has been historically imposed on local populations, like Catalonia or the Basque country, it is the migrants that speak the Spanish language and that they bring it back and kind of impose it in everyday life. Especially migrants from Latin America, but also before that, as Maggie said, it was from people from interior migration that came from Andalusia and other parts of Spain. And now, of course, their children, their first language is Castellano, it's Spanish, it's not Basque nor Catalan in the case of Catalonia. So I figured that it wasn't interesting particularity of Spain, of how the colonial and the decolonial are being intertwined through language. The colonized the labor of the migrants brings again the colonizer's language into the public life. And in these territories, the separation between nationalists, the left and the right, is not as clear-cut as it may be in other parts of Europe. And I think this is also something that brings us to Smadar's presentation of today. And of course, a very interesting aspect was the link between feminist activism and other activism in the Basque country, that maybe you would like to elaborate further in the questions and the comments, especially the aspect of intersectionality and what you said about how people may suffer different types of oppression, and this may have gaps in their understanding. So in this regard, your presentation, when you talked about other kinds of oppression, it reminded me of Liliana Suarez Navas's approach to decolonization and post-colonial feminism, who suggests that we should try to deepen our singularities, to be attentive to histories of exclusion, poverty, and devaluation of women and their communities in order to add to a universal project without excluding minoritarian identities. And this is where I will end with a question that you may want to elaborate on regarding how we add to this universal project while keeping our local struggles alive. So I would like to ask you about the most recent developments in Spanish feminism, which have been a reply to local struggles, as for example, against gender violence. What I have in mind is the massive response to the Manada case, but also at the same time, they are synchronized with the global feminist movement in Latin America, like the Ni Una Menos movement, and worldwide, like protests that we see on social media. So yes, I would like to see your perspective about the particularities of the contemporary feminist movement as it is reflected in the Basque country. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christina, for your comments and questions as a discussant. Yes, if I may add some questions and some more elaboration, I'm very interested on the colonial character of our society, as you said, Maggie, for the Basque country. And so if we can start from this and develop a little bit more this idea about the matrix of coloniality. Where is the matrix of coloniality in the Basque case? I think we can develop an interesting thought based on this idea developed by Maria Lugones also, and found the particular palimpsest of patriarchies interconnected in different places, as is the case of Israel or in the Basque countries or elsewhere. So now we can open discussion, I think, and take questions from the audience for a first round, and then continue. Are there, unless there are no questions for the moment, then you can reply to your discussants. I can't see hands. Hands up, please. Okay, Vasiliki Polycarpou.
Καλησπέρα. Ναι, Πολυκάρπου. Hello to everyone. Thank you very much for your presentations. I would like to ask something, Maggie Bullen. Sorry if I pronounce it in the wrong way. You mentioned the civil war during your presentation, and I would like to ask which are the positions of the feminist movement in the country of Basque concerning the issue of civil war. For example, it's just a reference for me that Pedro Almodovar, in his last film, Madres Paralelas, used a historical framework of this story in order to present his position on this issue. And I understand from my discussion with some Spanish friends that this is a complex issue for the context of Spain right now, and too many demonstrations had begun to emerge in Madrid and Barcelona. So I would like to know which are the feminist perceptions of this issue. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Vasiliki. And another question, please, from the audience. If you see some hands, no. Okay, we can go starting by Maggie and then going to Smadar. Okay, Maggie.
Okay. Thank you. Gosh, thank you very much. Thank you, Christina, for all those thoughts. I think I won't answer everything because it would take up too much time. But I've noted down a couple of things. And if there is time, we can come back to others. One of the things that you've pointed to and asked that was interesting was how feminism is expressed in cultural and musical forms, how the resistance goes through from tradition, so that there's something going on there where we've got a strong resistance to change, but then we've got some feminists being tremendously creative. And in those, I didn't mention before the Bertsolaris, who are like a kind of stand-up poet who improvise and compete. And I think there's some really great work done there. In fact, I can just see out of the corner of my eye, La Rai Sarit Navarrete is with us this afternoon, and she has some great work on this particular issue. So if anybody's interested in that, there's the female Bertsolaris who are performing. They've not only revolutionized the whole practice of being Bertsolaris, but the themes, the way they're addressing feminist issues is really quite extraordinary. So that is an area to look at. Then we've got they bring in all sorts of themes into that. You also asked me about how different themes come in together. And that's what we're looking at in this last research that I've mentioned. So it's interesting how feminism seems to be the most transversal of all the movements within the social movements. So initially there were lots of things happening between the feminists and pro-Basque movements, and feminist movement in the Basque country tends to place a lot of importance on the language issue. So we seek strategies of how do we cope with this. Are we going to go over to Spanish because we've got non-Spanish speakers? How are we going to incorporate new people from other countries? And they have strategies such as in their meetings, they've developed the technique of whispering. So you have somebody speaking in Basque and somebody at the same time translating, whispering in the background to those who don't understand, and hence keeping the presence of Euskera. So lots of things going on there. So then the Euskera also links up with this concern for diversity. And there's a lot of groups that have sprung up with women from Ecuador. Malenechea is a group that's been going on for a long time for migrant women. So a lot of points of connection there. And the latest is, of course, ecology. There's a lot of new movements or movements that have come to the fore for environmental justice. And again, feminism is part of what they're doing. Feminism links up. So a lot of strategies there. Of course, the question you raised, Christine, of how to manage the universal of feminism and at the same time, without losing sight of the local, is the age-old question. And that's kind of what the alardes are all about. It's about, in this case, like the mistaken idea of thinking that we've got to hold on to our tradition because we're special, we're different. If we don't, we'll lose our sense of self. But feminism is saying we can do both. No, we've got to keep moving, we can change, we can bring in equality, and we can still be Basque. So I think that's a really good example of the tensions this produces, the fight over it, but that it is, the message is that it's possible to reinvent tradition. After you all know Hobsbawm's work on that. Of course, I didn't go into the violence. That was something that's huge. It's at the forefront of the feminist agenda in the Basque Country, in Spain, in France, as it is with you, I know. And of course, it's the Manada case that really made that come to the forefront of the media, of public awareness, although it's something, and this again goes on in the festive sphere of Spanish and Basque life, is very much a festive one. And there, even before the Manada, there had long been, goes back like 10 years before, there was the killing of a woman in Pamplona, a woman actually from Irún, Nahore Lafage. And it's her case that also, from then, there's also been demonstrating this, and like you say, it's taken up with the Latin American, no ni una menos, not one less. So this is, the Basques come out every time there is a feminicide, there's major protests, and I know that's the same for you. Just going quickly here, because I don't want to take up too much time, but to answer Fotini, I think that's such an incredible question. And the matrix of coloniality, where is it in the Basque case? I'm going to have to think about this one. Where is it? I find that difficult to pin down. You're going to have to let me think about it, but perhaps we can all think about it together, because that's one of those concepts that when we want to translate it to reality, it's difficult. And finally, Vasiliki, I hope I'm saying your name right there. Again, the issue of the position of Basque women in the Spanish Civil War, there isn't one position, because the Basques, like the rest of Spain, the Basques weren't all with the Republicans. They weren't all against Franco. There was part of the, especially in Navarra, where they were Spanish nationalists, they supported Franco. And this again goes back a long way, because goes back to the notion even of the Carlists and the monarchies, that they used to defend. Basque difference was defended, in fact, by a very conservative part of Spain. So you'll find that, like the rest of Spain, they were torn down the middle. We can't say that all Basques were Republicans, that they were all against Franco. There's individual stories. Of course, the feminists, the stories of feminists, both in the Basque Country and in Spain, who lose their lives, who die, and many who go in and militate, then even within the armed group of ETA, but I can't give you like one position. It's complex. And I'll leave it there, but I can come back to anything that you'd like me to after.
Thank you, Maggie, for this reply. And now we can pass to Smadar for a second round, answering the questions and comments.
First, thanks again for organizing this amazing event, full of insights and very much out of this US-UK model that I designed. I mean, it does present anthropology that is not superimposed on realities, but actually emerging from lived realities of women who are marginalized, yet not marginalized. Like, I like the fact that the Basque women were a bit startled by the fact that in Spanish, they were addressed as not making sure that there is a safe space for women of color who are immigrants to Basque country and suffer racism from Basques. At any rate, I want to address two items. One of them is the ΜΙΖΡΑΧΙ couple, and the other is these involuntary spaces that are lived somatically, and it's very difficult for us to narrate. And they kind of like conjoin together. Let me just, I'm trying to remove the camera because it's kind of like disorients me. Anzaldúa model of conocimiento is kind of a rite of passage. And in my years of teaching it, living it, being around activists, I think that for feminism that doesn't work on this black-white axis that migrated from American feminism to the rest of the world, it's some sort of a rite of passage, because many of us can quote unquote pass as whites or Ashkenazi. Like recently, the Israeli regime employs cyber warfare in social media. And recently they said, Lavie passes, why does she complain? She did get to meet Golda Meir, so maybe she's elite. They took my meeting with Golda Meir when I was 16 completely out of context. I told her, listen, if you're going to make peace with the Arabs, we're going to have a civil war between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim. They didn't say that. So when you are in this kind of betwixt and between, it's easier for you or for many Mizrahi women to live in denial. The ideal of Mizrahi beauty is Nordic. Many Mizrahi women dye their hair blondes. Like for those of you who know Mizrahi music, Sarit Haddad, who is an idol of Mizrahi music, or Miri Buhadana, who's like a supermodel of diamonds, they're blonde. You can, like my mother, she went for 3 years, she took private lessons in unlearning her Mizrahi accent, which is the correct Semitic accent, and speaking like Ashkenazi Hebrew, which is a standard Hebrew, not pronouncing the ha and the ah and the sa, because there is accent discrimination. So you can pass as an Ashkenazi, but then you find out that, as Homi Baba says, you are white, but not quite white. And Anzaldúa describes the awakening of what happens to you in 7 stages that are some sort of, I guess, indigenous psychoanalytical journey until she comes to consciousness. So the spaces, the involuntary spaces that are lived somatically of many women of color of the unclassified kind, because they think they're white, but they're discriminated as not non-white white. They're very difficult to narrate. And in anthropology, we are narrative junkies. We need to have narrative or discourse in order to write it up and publish it as a book, as an article. Anzaldúa describes how this non-narrativity of the unclassifiable suffering, as the woman of color comes to consciousness, she narrates it herself. She doesn't need an anthropologist. She doesn't need a feminist from the university. She can come to power through voice by herself. And that leads me to the way that the Mizrahi couples basically muffle this kind of voice. It's a horrible term. And it's kind of like macabre Holocaust jokes that I guess Jews can tell to themselves. Kapos were the concentration camp prisoners that the Nazis employed as low-level management in exchange for all sorts of favors, like a little bit more bread or a little bit more potatoes, because Jews were in this labor camps and their diet was 300 calories a day. And when they could no longer work, they were killed. So Mizrahi couples are mainstream Mizrahi leaders. And they have to align themselves with the Ashkenazi hegemony if they want to make inroads into Israeli politics. And therefore, they must deny the intra-Jewish racial conflict. I mean, they can talk about Mizrahi music, Mizrahi food, but they cannot talk about the fact that the foundation of Zionism is not Jewish nationalism, but it's racial classification between Europeans and non-Europeans. And the Mizrahim and the Palestinians are the non-Europeans, because then they're questioning the whole foundation of the state. So Mizrahi couples basically judge anyone like me guilty of late bachien. That's how they trivialize me. I whine, I'm a crybaby. They basically take away my right to mourn my past in order to create a future. And in that sense, they're trying to take away my narrative. And let me end by an example from my field or homework. There is a very famous Israeli legal scholar who was denied tenure because she actually wrote the law that was passed in the Knesset against sexual harassment in the workplace. So there was a big scandal on why she was kicked out of the Hebrew University Law School, and they brought her back as a lecturer. So she's not exactly an independent scholar, but not as part of the professorial rank. And there was this very big feminist gathering in honor of that. All the speakers on the stage were Ashkenazi feminists. So we Mizrahi feminists decided to do direct action. I mean, the David Graeber kind of resistance. So we came to celebrate because in a sense it's a reason for celebration. But on the other hand, we decided to interrupt the festivities and ask where are the Mizrahi and where are the Palestinian speakers. The feminists were completely unprepared. We went on the stage, we took the microphones, and there was like a big, big, big ruckus in the audience. And then out stood a Mizrahi feminist with lots of credentials in the movement, but she basically needed an academic job to make a living. And she kind of stood there and she said that she feels very torn between her Mizrahi sisters and the Ashkenazi women who made it possible for her to enter into academia. And that kind of like symbolizes the crux of what I was talking about, which is the layers of who is allowed to speak and how we can decolonize this trying to make into discourse the involuntary spaces of suffering that are lived somatically. Because there are the Anglo-American feminists, also feminists of color. And then there is the elite from the global South who goes to Anglo-American universities. And then they use the grassroots feminists who don't have access to the university because of politics, because of class, because they need money to translate their work into English, which is a tyrannical language. They use this kind of feminists as informants rather than engaging with them. I guess a non-gender example, I don't remember the detail, but I remember as when I did research for my book, I encountered it, is the manner in which Michael Hartzfeld treated Greek anthropologists as informants rather than talking with them on a horizontal level in his work on Greek bureaucracy. So in that sense, I think the way to do it, and I think that the material from Basque country is very encouraging, is basically to try and put this hierarchical order topsy-turvy and really let the subaltern speak. Not let even someone like me, who's trained in Berkeley, speak for the subaltern with my academic privilege, even though while I was in Israel, I was unemployed and I was a welfare mother, eating scraps from the market and expired food, just because I'm not allowed to work there in my profession. And the only thing I know aside from feminist organizing is anthropology.
Thank you very much, Smadar, for this reply. I think we are out of time, and but if you have some emergency to ask our two speakers, please, this is the time. I can't see hands. So I would like to close this very, very interesting webinar, in my opinion. Thanks to your contribution, my dearest ladies, because you gave us all these tools of participant epistemology, of feminist horizontal modality, of epistemological crossroads between anthropology and history and autoethnography. We are more, let's say, we have more knowledge about conocimiento model, if I pronounce well, and we can engage with in order to search for the epistemic mark, the hidden dark, part of our culture and our society, where we can find the dark heart of the beast, which is patriarchy in its local modalities and genealogies and methodologies. So I would like to finish this and make a promise that we can continue the discussion by adding more examples from the Mediterranean borders, at least, from Caucasus, from Tunisia, the Black feminists in Tunisia. Maybe next year, if we have the courage to continue, because I think this discussion opens new horizons for decolonize us also, and for anthropology, and for ourselves as feminists or as citizens engaged with social struggles. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. It has been an amazing experience, and thank you very much for sharing your experience and kind of perspective with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Foteini, for organizing it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sisi. Thank you, Christina, for being
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Have a good night.
Have a good
Thank
night.
you.
Bye-bye.
Let me stop
Bye-bye.
recording.
Okay.